The last time anyone in her family saw Nancy Guthrie, she was being dropped off at her own front door. It was 9:45 on a Saturday night, January 31st, 2026. She had just spent the evening at her daughter Annie's house in the Catalina Foothills, north of Tucson, Arizona. Dinner, laughter, the kind of night an 84-year-old grandmother collects like small treasures. Her children watched the garage door close behind her. They drove away. And somewhere between that closing door and the first light of Sunday morning, Nancy Guthrie ceased to exist within the boundaries of what anyone can explain. She didn't show up the next day to watch an online church service at a friend's house. That was the alarm. Not a frantic phone call at 3 a.m., not a neighbor hearing something disturbing. It was the absence of a woman who simply didn't miss church. Her family called 911 around noon on February 1st, and what followed has become one of the most puzzling, quietly devastating missing persons cases the American Southwest has seen in years. Not because the investigation went cold, but because at every turn, the evidence tells investigators exactly enough to keep searching, and not quite enough to find her. Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos stood before cameras that first Sunday night and said something that cut through every diplomatic layer law enforcement usually wraps around uncertain situations. He said, "She did not leave on her own." We know that. He called her home a crime scene. He described drops of what appeared to be biological material, later confirmed through DNA analysis to match Nancy Guthrie, leading from the entryway of the house outward, down the pathway toward the driveway. That detail alone reframes everything. She wasn't just missing, she was taken. And the person who took her had a plan, a timeline, and a level of operational knowledge about her home that raises a question that has been simmering beneath the surface of this investigation since the very beginning. How did they know she would be home that night? There is a moment in this case where the timeline becomes genuinely unsettling, and it happens in the quiet hours between 2 and 3 in the morning. At 2:12 a.m., motion detection software registered movement on a camera at Guthrie's home. But here is the critical detail. There was no active subscription on that camera account, which meant no footage was recorded. The camera saw something and said nothing. At 2:28 a.m., 16 minutes later, Nancy's pacemaker disconnected from the phone application it had been synced to. A medical device designed to monitor a heart suddenly going dark in the middle of the night. For investigators, that timestamp isn't just data, it's a marker. It places the probable moment of forcible removal inside a 16-minute window in near total darkness, in a neighborhood where no one heard a thing. The FBI released security footage the following week, and when those images hit the public, something shifted in the national consciousness around this case. The figure on the porch is masked, gloved, and deliberate. He is wearing what the Pima County Sheriff described as a unique gun holster. Not a standard configuration. Not something pulled off a shelf at a big box store without characteristics that might be traceable. He is carrying an Ozark Trail backpack, the kind sold at Walmart. He may be wearing a ring. He is between 5'9" and 5'10". And he had already, before this footage was captured, removed the Nest doorbell camera from Nancy's home. Think about that sequence of actions for a moment. He approached the property knowing where the camera was. He removed it before doing anything else. That is not impulsive behavior. That is the behavior of someone who had either visited the property before, surveilled it in advance, or had access to information about its layout that wasn't available through a casual drive-by. Investigators began canvassing gun shops across Arizona trying to match the holster. They began working with Walmart managers across the state to cross-reference sales of that specific Ozark Trail backpack, pulling purchase records, searching for credit card transactions, hunting for surveillance footage of the buyer walking through a store entrance. These are the kinds of investigative threads that feel painstaking and procedural from the outside, but each one represents a real possibility of a name, a face, an address. Then came the gloves. A pair of gloves matching the ones worn by the figure in the porch footage was recovered approximately 2 miles from Nancy Guthrie's home. The FBI ran the DNA extracted from those gloves through CODIS, the national database containing the genetic profiles of convicted offenders and arrestees. No match. The suspect, as of this recording, has no prior criminal record that placed their DNA in federal systems, which means one of several things. This person has never been arrested for a qualifying offense. They operated with extraordinary care about not leaving a trail before this, or they are someone whose criminal history exists entirely outside the reach of the databases investigators typically rely on. That last possibility, and what it implies about geography, has not been lost on law enforcement. Though officials stated there is currently no evidence that Nancy Guthrie was transported across the U.S.-Mexico border, they have been coordinating with Mexican authorities since the earliest days of the investigation. The border is approximately 65 miles from Tucson. That is not a footnote. It is a variable that refuses to be ruled out entirely. This is the part of the investigation where science steps in to do what databases couldn't. Authorities announced that they are now pursuing investigative genetic genealogy, the same methodology that identified the Golden State Killer after decades of failure, the same science that placed Brian Kohberger at the University of Idaho murders before a single witness had come forward. DNA expert Cece Moore, who has worked on hundreds of cases using this technique, appeared on the Today Show and said something that should be resonating with whoever left those gloves. If I was the kidnapper, I would be extremely concerned right now because using investigative genetic genealogy, he will be identified. Genetic genealogy doesn't need a prior arrest. It doesn't need a match in CODIS. It builds a family tree from partial DNA, works outward through ancestry databases, and walks investigators to a door through relatives the suspect didn't know they shared with the investigation. It takes time, but it has never permanently failed a case where viable DNA was present. And then there are the ransom communications, the thread of this case that operates at a different register entirely, one that touches on something uniquely contemporary and deeply unsettling about the moment we are living in. The Guthrie family publicly acknowledged awareness of what appeared to be ransom correspondence. Savannah Guthrie appeared on Instagram on February 4th alongside her siblings Annie and Cameron, and she addressed the person responsible directly. She said the family was ready to talk. She said they were ready to listen. She also said something that deserves to be held up to the light. We live in a world where voices and images are easily manipulated. We need to know without a doubt that she is alive and that you have her. The family was not only negotiating under duress, they were negotiating in an environment where proof of life itself has become epistemologically unstable. A video of an 84-year-old woman speaking can now be generated without her presence. A voice saying, "I'm okay," means nothing if it was assembled by software. This is the ransom crisis of the AI era, playing out in real time, and the Guthrie family found themselves navigating it while also grieving, while also hoping, while also standing in front of cameras because they had no other tools. On February 7th, a week after Nancy disappeared, Savannah sat with her siblings and recorded another message. This one contained 4 words that changed the tone of everything. "This is very valuable to us and we will pay." The family had acknowledged a deadline. They had acknowledged they received a message. The FBI's reward, initially set at $50,000, was subsequently raised to $100,000. President Donald Trump, in a phone interview with the New York Post, said the Justice Department would seek the most severe federal penalties available, including capital punishment, if Nancy Guthrie is not returned alive. The political weight of this case has reached a level that is almost impossible to overstate. And yet, as of the time this script was finalized, February 19, 2026, 19 days after Nancy Guthrie disappeared from her own doorstep, her whereabouts remain unknown. Over 400 investigators are working this case. Tens of thousands of tips have poured into the FBI and Pima County Sheriff's tip lines. A man named Luke Daly, 37, was briefly detained and had his home searched in the second week of the investigation, and was released without charges, his attorney confirming he had no connection to Nancy Guthrie. A delivery driver named Carlos Palazuelos was questioned after his name surfaced and released after several hours, stating he didn't know Guthrie and had no involvement. The Guthrie family was formally and publicly cleared as suspects by Sheriff Nanos, who made a point of stating that to suggest otherwise was not only wrong, it is cruel. The sheriff's directness on that point matters, because online, as in virtually every high-profile missing persons case, speculation had begun circling the people closest to the victim, the family who last saw her, the daughter who was dropped off and drove away. Nanos cut that off with institutional authority, but the murmur never fully stops in these cases. It never does. One detail that has received relatively little public attention, yet may carry more investigative weight than almost anything else in this case, is the matter of the pacemaker. Nancy Guthrie's cardiac device has Bluetooth functionality. It was connected to a phone application. Specialists have noted that such devices, depending on their model and configuration, may be capable of emitting a signal detectable at range, potentially identifiable by aircraft, drones, or specialized equipment. Whether investigators have pursued this avenue and what they may or may not have discovered through it has not been publicly disclosed. The silence around this detail is either the silence of an active lead being protected or the silence of a technical dead end. Either way, it sits at the edge of this investigation like something that isn't quite resolved. What kind of person does something like this? That question sounds like the opening line of a criminal psychology lecture, but it is worth sitting with because the behavioral profile here is genuinely unusual. This was not a crime of opportunity. The removal of the doorbell camera, the timing in the hours before dawn, the specific and deliberate nature of the approach on that porch. These indicate planning that preceded the night of January 31st by at minimum days and possibly weeks. The target is an 84-year-old woman with limited mobility who requires daily cardiac medication. That makes her simultaneously a high-profile target through her daughter's national visibility and an extraordinarily vulnerable one. The ransom communication, if authentic, suggests the motivation is financial. But financial motivation at this level, against a target with these vulnerabilities, in an area this close to an international border, also suggests a level of organizational sophistication that most individual actors don't possess. This may not be one person acting alone, and that possibility opens the investigation outward in directions that a single suspect framework simply can't contain. Nancy Guthrie was born January 27, 1942, in Fort Wright, Kentucky. She turned 84 4 days before she vanished. She raised 3 children after losing her husband Charles in 1988. He died at 49 on a mining exploration trip in Mexico, a detail her daughter Savannah has mentioned publicly over the years as a formative wound in the family's history. Nancy lived alone in the Catalina Foothills for decades. Her neighbors described the kind of person who is quietly present in a community, not invisible, not celebrated, just there, reliably, Sunday after Sunday. Sharp, the sheriff said. Sharp as a tack. Living with physical limitations but without any cognitive decline. A woman who knew exactly what was happening to her when it happened. Savannah Guthrie, in the final public video before the script was completed, said something that deserves to end here, because it may be the most precise articulation of what this family is enduring. We still have hope, and we still believe. It is never too late to do the right thing. You're not lost or alone. She was speaking to whoever has her mother. But the sentence lands differently depending on who is listening. For the investigators, it is a reminder of what is at stake. For the public following this case, it is an invitation to stay engaged, to keep the image of a masked figure with a unique holster circulating, to keep asking whether anyone in their community has seen something that didn't register at the time. And for whoever took Nancy Guthrie from her garage door on that January night, it may be the only off-ramp that exists before genetic genealogy walks investigators the rest of the way. Nancy Guthrie is still out there somewhere. The DNA is being mapped, the holster is being traced, the Walmart receipts are being pulled. The science that caught the Golden State Killer is now pointed at a pair of discarded gloves found on the edge of the Sonoran Desert. And 400 people are showing up every morning to a case that, 19 days in, has not gone cold. The question is no longer whether investigators will identify the person who did this. The question is whether they will find Nancy Guthrie in time to matter.